The ferry's engine groaned, a mournful sound swallowed almost immediately by the dense gray fog that clung to the water like a shroud. Dean stood at the bow, shoulders hunched against the chill, his gaze fixed on the indistinct mass that was the island. It was a place he'd never known, inherited along with a lifetime of his grandfather's silence, a silence that now echoed the one in Dean's own life. Grief was a lead weight in his chest, a constant pressure that made every breath a conscious effort. He'd come here, to this desolate rock, seeking not just solitude, but a kind of brutal, geographical cure for the gnawing emptiness. The vessel scraped against barnacled pilings, a shudder running through its hull. The ferryman, a burly man with eyes the color of the sea on a stormy day, gestured vaguely towards a narrow, slick ramp. "That's it then, Dean," he rumbled, his voice thick with the island's isolation. "Last stop." Dean nodded, clutched the strap of his duffel bag tighter, stepped onto the small, moss-slicked dock. The fog here was thicker, muffling the distant cry of gulls, blurring the line between sea and sky. He was alone, truly alone. The path to the lighthouse keeper's cottage was little more than a goat track, winding precariously along the cliff edge. Dean, a cartographer by trade, found himself instinctively mapping the terrain in his mind, cataloging the gnarled, wind-battered trees, the skeletal remains of forgotten fences, the way the lichen crawled over every exposed stone. The island felt ancient, worn smooth by centuries of relentless weather, its very bones steeped in an unnerving stillness. He walked for what felt like an hour, the fog clinging to him, dampening his clothes, blurring the world until only the immediate path existed. Then, through a sudden, brief thinning of the mist, he saw it. Below it, nestled into the lee of the cliff, was the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a squat stone structure with a slate roof, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. It looked less like a home and more like a tomb. A rusted wrought iron gate, half off its hinges, marked the entrance to the overgrown yard. Dean pushed it open, the screech of metal on metal tearing through the quiet. The garden was a tangle of thorny bushes and weeds, reclaiming the space with an aggressive tenacity. The front door, painted a faded, peeling blue, was swollen in its frame. He fumbled with the heavy, tarnished key his grandfather's lawyer had given him, the cold metal biting into his palm. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. Dean dropped his bag in the entryway, the thud echoing in the empty space. He moved through the small rooms, his footsteps loud on the bare floorboards. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if his grandfather had simply vanished one day, leaving behind only the ghost of his presence. In the living room, a heavy oak desk stood against one wall, cluttered with old charts and navigational tools. Dean ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood. His grandfather's profession had always been a mystery, a reclusive man who charted forgotten currents and unseen depths. He pulled open a drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of brittle, yellowed sea charts, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was embossed with a single, cryptic symbol he didn't recognize, a stylized, three-pronged trident intertwined with a looping serpentine line. He picked it up, the leather surprisingly cool against his skin. The pages were filled with his grandfather's spidery handwriting, observations on weather patterns, tide tables, and then, towards the back, unsettling fragmented entries about the deep and the pull. As he stood there, absently tracing the symbol on the journal, a faint thump-scrape sound drifted up from beneath the floorboards. It was subtle, easily dismissed as the house settling or the wind playing tricks. But it happened again, a deliberate, rhythmic thump-scrape. Thump-scrape. Dean paused, his head tilted, listening intently. He moved cautiously, his cartographer's instinct for discovery overriding his unease, and found a heavy iron ring set into one of the floorboards near the fireplace hearth. It was almost hidden by the dust and neglect. He knelt, his fingers brushing away decades of accumulated grime. He tugged. A ladder, narrow and precarious, descended into the black. This was no ordinary cellar. This was an underground bunker. Dean hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. The thump scrape had stopped. He peered down, straining his eyes. He could make out the glint of what looked like rough-hewn stone walls, disappearing into an impenetrable gloom. He felt a profound sense of intrusion, as if he had stumbled upon a secret that had been carefully guarded for generations. But his grandfather's journal, clutched in his hand, felt suddenly heavy, a silent invitation to explore the very depths he now instinctively feared. Dean froze, his hand still resting on the journal's worn cover, the faint symbol cool beneath his fingertips. The thump scrape repeated, a deliberate rhythm now, not a random creak. It was slow, heavy, like something being dragged across rough timber directly beneath his feet. He held his breath, straining to hear over the distant roar of the ocean. The old house, a symphony of groans and sighs in the perpetual wind, seemed to quiet, as if listening too. He told himself it was the house settling, the old pilings shifting in the island's sandy soil. Or perhaps a rodent, larger than he liked to imagine, scuttling through the crawl space. Yet the sound had a density to it, a resonant quality that felt too substantial for a mere animal. He waited, muscles tensed, for it to happen again. Silence. Only the ceaseless wind, keening around the eaves like a lonely spirit. He slowly exhaled, a shaky breath, and pulled his hand back from the journal, the symbol's faint impression lingering on his skin. It had to be the wind. It always was, on this island. The following morning, the sea was a different beast. Dean, a cartographer by trade, lived by the predictable patterns of the earth and its waters. He understood currents, tides, the rhythmic pulse of the ocean. But as he stood on the craggy shore, the air thick with the metallic tang of salt and decay, he found himself staring at something deeply unsettling. The tide was far out, much further than it should have been for this time of day, exposing a stretch of slick, black rock usually submerged. He walked along the waterline, his boots crunching on crushed shells, his eyes scanning the exposed seabed. It was an unnatural recession, a vast, hungry gulp of the ocean breath. Then, just as abruptly, the water surged back, a silent, powerful wave that rushed inland with startling speed, reclaiming the exposed rock and forcing Dean to scramble higher up the beach. There was no storm, no distant tremor to explain such a violent, unheralded shift. The ocean itself seemed to be breathing erratically, a vast, living thing suffering from a profound unease. Later, back in the cottage, the air grew heavy, pregnant with the scent of brine and something else. Something vaguely organic, like wet stone and ancient moss. The wind picked up, howling around the cottage, rattling the loose panes in the windows. It carried whispers now, not just the mournful moan of the gales, but faint, guttural sounds that seemed to weave themselves into the fabric of the wind. They were formless, just on the edge of comprehension, like a chorus of low, throaty murmurs rising from the depths. He tried to dismiss them as the wind playing tricks on the old house, the creaks and groans of timber and glass. But sometimes, a particular cadence, a strange inflection would catch his ear, making the hairs on his arms prickle. He'd pause, head cocked, listening intently, only for the sounds to dissipate into the general roar of the storm, leaving him questioning his own perception. Was the solitude getting to him already? Determined to ground himself in something tangible, Dean returned to his grandfather's study, a room still heavy with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco. He needed to organize, to map out the chaos. He pulled open a drawer in the heavy oak desk, expecting to find old charts or ledgers. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was his grandfather's, sprawling and angular. but the words themselves were a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. He flipped through, the pages rustling like dry leaves. Most were filled with bizarre, intricate sketches. They weren't maps, not in any conventional sense. They were abstract, almost alien forms, undulating lines, swirling vortexes, and impossible geometries that seemed to writhe and coil across the paper. Then he found it. A page, less water damaged than the others, bore a stark warning scrawled in thick, desperate strokes. The deep song. It calls, it pulls. Don't listen. Don't let it in. Below it, a crude drawing of the symbol from the first journal, the one he'd absently traced. But this version was surrounded by concentric circles, like ripples in water, each one studded with tiny, almost microscopic eyes. The journal wasn't just a record. It was a testament to a mind unraveling. He remembered the stories of his grandfather's eccentricities, the isolation that had supposedly claimed him. He was a cartographer, a man of logic and reason. There had to be a logical explanation. His grandfather's frantic warnings. His gaze fell upon a heavy trapdoor set into the corner of the study floor, half hidden beneath a threadbare rug. With a surge of morbid curiosity, he knelt, his fingers finding the cold metal ring. He pulled, and with a groan of old wood and rusted hinges, the trapdoor lifted, revealing a gaping blackness below. An underground bunker. He had to. He held his breath, straining to discern the source, the texture of the sound. Was it the house settling, a large beam shifting against stone? The air in the small study grew cold, a damp chill seeping into his bones despite the roaring fire. He waited, muscles rigid, listening until his ears ached. The sound didn't repeat. The silence that followed was not empty, but thick with an unspoken presence. He told himself it was the wind, the old house groaning under the relentless maritime pressure. Yet the conviction felt thin, fragile. That thump-scrape had been too specific, too rhythmic. Shaking his head, he tried to dislodge the creeping unease, but it clung to him like the island's persistent fog. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His cartographer's mind, accustomed to mapping the known, now grappled with the terrifying prospect of charting the unknown. He needed answers, and he suspected they lay buried in his grandfather's obsessive notes and the island's forgotten history. The next days bled into each other, a blur of frantic research. Dean unearthed every scrap of paper his grandfather had left behind. Old charts, some hand-drawn and meticulously annotated, lay stacked beside brittle newspaper clippings and thick, leather-bound tomes on local folklore. The cottage became a whirlwind of dust and parchment, the scent of aged paper and salt filling the air. He worked with a feverish intensity, driven by a growing, gnawing certainty that the thump-scrape was not a figment of his imagination. His gaze, trained to interpret contours and elevations, now sought patterns in the chaos of his grandfather's research. He found repeated references to the deep, the unsleeping eye, and the sunken city in fragmented notes scrawled across margins. One particular set of coordinates, marked with a small, familiar symbol, the same one from the journal, kept reappearing on various coastal maps. It pointed not to a landmass, but to a submerged point several miles offshore. More disturbing were the repeated mentions of the ancient rite and the binding pact in his grandfather's personal journal. His grandfather, it seemed, had been obsessed with preventing something from rising. One afternoon, amidst a pile of mildewed maritime records, Dean found a brittle, hand-drawn map of the island itself. Unlike any official chart, this one detailed a subterranean network beneath the lighthouse, a series of tunnels and chambers leading to a single marked location, an underground bunker. A note in his grandfather's distinctive spidery hand read, "The last sanctuary." He remembered the thump-scrape from beneath the floor. Could it have been connected to this bunker? Armed with a powerful lantern and a deep sense of foreboding, he followed the map's crude directions. The entrance was cleverly concealed behind a loose stone panel in the old root cellar, a place he hadn't fully explored. The passage was narrow, the walls rough-hewn stones slick with moisture. His breath plumed in the frigid air. Around the base of the altar and creeping up the walls in intricate vein-like patterns was a strange, iridescent growth. It pulsed with a faint, ethereal green light, almost like living phosphorescence. Bioluminescent algae, he realized with a jolt, unlike anything he had ever seen. It seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. He spent hours in the bunker, deciphering faded inscriptions, cross-referencing them with his grandfather's journal. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The pact wasn't just a metaphor, it was a literal agreement, an ancient binding forged between the island's first inhabitants and an entity from the deep to keep it dormant. His grandfather had been its reluctant keeper, tasked with maintaining the delicate balance. And now, something had awakened it. The algae, the creeping glow, was a manifestation of its encroaching presence. Exhaustion finally forced his back to the cottage. He collapsed into a fitful sleep, the image of the glowing bunker burned behind his eyelids. His dreams were vivid, disturbing tapestries woven from the day's discoveries. He was underwater, the pressure immense, crushing. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through his very bones, a sound that was both a call and a warning. He saw the symbol from the journal, glowing with the same unearthly green as the bunker algae, expanding, consuming everything. He pushed himself upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, and peered into the gloom. There, spreading across the aged oak floorboards, creeping up the leg of his grandfather's desk, was the same bioluminescent algae he'd seen in the underground bunker. It pulsed with an insidious emerald light, a tangible tendril of the deep's malevolence reaching into his sanctuary. It wasn't just in the bunker, it was here, inside the cottage, a silent, glowing invasion. The entity wasn't merely stirring beneath the waves. It was already here, seeping into the very fabric of his reality. The air that rushed out was not merely cold, but held a distinct, briny chill, like breath from the deep earth. He aimed the powerful beam of his lantern into the void. A crude, uneven tunnel descended sharply, steps carved directly into the bedrock, slick with condensation. The walls, rough-hewn, glistened under the light, reflecting a sickly sheen. Dean hesitated, a tremor of apprehension running through him. But the map, his grandfather's desperate scrawl, pulled him forward. The tunnel opened into a cramped circular chamber, the underground bunker his grandfather had marked. The air here was thicker, heavier, pressing in on his eardrums. The lantern beam cut through the gloom, revealing walls plastered with strange, intricate carvings. Not decorative, but frantic, almost violent, etched deep into the rock. They depicted swirling eddies, jagged lines resembling teeth, and distorted, almost human figures caught in impossible currents. Dean traced a finger over one particularly complex symbol, a vortex-like pattern that seemed to pull at his gaze. It was a ward, he realized, a desperate attempt to keep something out. In the center of the chamber, a rough stone plinth stood, chipped and stained. On its surface, an array of objects lay arranged with meticulous, disturbing care. In the middle, a small, intricate carving of a fish, crafted from bone, lay broken in half. A faint, sweet, sickly odor, like decaying flowers and old sea salt, clung to the air around it. Dean's stomach churned. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a site of ritual. His grandfather hadn't just been hiding from something. He'd been trying to appease it, or perhaps to sacrifice. The thought sent a jolt of icy fear through him. What had his grandfather given to whatever lurked beyond the veil? A low, resonant hum began, a vibration that started in the soles of his boots and slowly climbed his legs, settling in his chest. It wasn't a sound he could pinpoint. but a feeling, a deep, pervasive thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very rock around him, from the air itself. It was hypnotic, almost comforting in its regularity, yet deeply unsettling, like the steady beat of an enormous, unseen heart. Dean gripped the lantern tighter, his knuckles white. He backed away slowly, the hum growing louder, vibrating through his teeth. He needed to get out. He scrambled up the rough-hewn steps, the feeling of unseen eyes boring into his back. The stone clattered back into place, sealing the bunker, but the hum, faint now, seemed to follow him, a ghost of a sound just at the edge of his perception. Back in the cottage, the familiar scent of damp wood and old paper offered little comfort. The hum persisted, a deep bass note in the symphony of the island's wind and waves, a constant, insidious presence. Dean tried to focus, to calm his racing thoughts, but the image of the bunker's carved walls, the plinth, the broken bonefish, replayed in his mind. He walked to the small table where his maps lay spread. As he reached for a pencil, his eyes caught on his teacup. It sat on a coaster, exactly where he'd left it, but as he watched, a faint shiver ran through the porcelain. The cup spun a fraction of an inch, then settled. Dean blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks. He stared at it, unmoving, for a long minute. Nothing. He shook his head. Exhaustion. He moved to the sink, splashed cold water on his face. He looked into the small, grimy mirror above it. His reflection stared back, pale and drawn. Then, in an instant, it snapped back, his normal, haggard reflection staring out, accusingly. Dean gasped, stumbling back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He gripped the edge of the counter, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It wasn't his eyes playing tricks. It was a direct assault, a violation of his perception. It felt like the cottage itself was resonating with it, a vast, unseen engine coming to life beneath the waves. He spun, his gaze darting around the small room. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, a silent, sinuous grace gliding across the floor towards him. It came closer, the frigid air around it biting at his skin. He could feel its presence, a profound, crushing weight of utter indifference, of an ancient, consuming hunger. Dean flung himself backwards, tripping over a loose rug, crashing to the floor. It was no longer a distant threat. It was here, in his home, a palpable, malevolent presence, and it had almost touched him. He aimed his lamp into the void. Dean gripped the journal tighter, its worn leather cover a strangely comforting presence in his hand. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of wet rock and ancient stagnation, and began his descent. Reaching a small, damp landing, Dean swept his light across the space. It was a narrow, circular room, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a low, arched ceiling. In the center, a simple wooden table stood, coated in a fine layer of dust, flanked by a single rickety chair. He noticed faint, swirling symbols etched into the stone walls, almost imperceptible beneath the grime. His grandfather had spent time down here, a lot of time. Dean pulled the chair out, its legs grating on the stone floor, and sat. He placed the journal on the table, opening it to the latest entries, his lamp illuminating the faded script. The tides are turning, the barrier thins. I can hear the cadence more clearly now, even when the wind howls. Dean's eyes scanned the page, his brow furrowing. He'd dismissed it as imagination, or perhaps the drone of the old lighthouse mechanism. But his grandfather had heard it too. The offerings must be precise, the incantations exact. If even a syllable falters, the hunger will stir. It seeks a breach, it seeks egress. His breath hitched. Offerings? Incantations? This wasn't merely observation. This was involvement. His grandfather wasn't just a keeper of the light. He was a keeper of something else. A protector, perhaps, against the very thing Dean was now sensing. The reclusive old man hadn't been eccentric. He'd been fighting a war. As he read, the rhythmic dripping water in the bunker seemed to sink with an internal beat. A low thrum, familiar yet unsettling, began to resonate in his ears. Not from outside, but from within his own skull. The words on the page began to swim, the ink blurring, twisting into serpentine shapes. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the effect persisted. He focused again on the journal, forcing his eyes to clarify the text. The deep song. It calls to me, promising understanding, promising peace. But I know its true nature. It seeks to unravel the mind, to prepare the vessel. My vigilance must not waver. The ritual must hold. The deep song. Dean felt it now, a subtle, insidious melody playing just at the edge of his hearing. A siren call promising oblivion. It was a sweet, heavy lethargy, pulling at his consciousness. This was what his grandfather had warned about. This was the erosion of sanity. He stood, needing to move, to break the spell. He swept his lamp around the circular room again, his gaze lingering on the etched symbols. They weren't mere decorations. They were part of the ritual. Safeguards. His grandfather had been actively binding something, maintaining a fragile peace. His lamp beam, as it passed over a section of the wall opposite the entrance, caught something different. A faint seam, almost invisible, running vertically down the rough stone. It was too precise, too straight to be natural. Dean pressed his palm against it. Driven by a sudden, desperate need to understand, he ran his fingers along the seam, searching. His fingers brushed against a small, almost imperceptible indentation. He pressed. This wasn't just an underground bunker. This was a gateway. And at the very end of the passage, barely visible in the struggling lamplight, he could make out the faint, unsettling glint of something reflective, something ancient and deeply disturbing, waiting within what could only be a hidden chamber or crypt. He had to know. The deep song had not relinquished its hold. It was a current, pulling at Dean's very core, a sweet, heavy lethargy that promised a painless surrender. He fought it, a silent battle waged against the insidious tendrils of sound that sought to lull him into oblivion. His teeth gritted, jaw aching, he forced his eyelids open, the salt-laced air stinging his eyes, a welcome jolt of reality. He would not succumb. Not yet. Not before he understood. The compass, clutched in his trembling hand, spun erratically, then settled, its needle quivering, pointing not to magnetic north, but inland, towards the island's scarred heart. He remembered his grandfather's cryptic journals, the strange symbols, the repeated warnings about the deep place and the ancient pact. A cold certainty settled in his stomach, heavier than the fog that still clung to the coastline. The answers, he knew, lay where the compass pointed. He stumbled inland, the deep song a constant hum behind his ears, a pressure building behind his eyes. The ground beneath his boots grew softer, the path overgrown, choked with thorny brambles that tore at his oilskins. The air thickened, losing its crisp coastal tang, replaced by a damp, earthy smell, laced with something metallic and vaguely stagnant. The fog here was different too, denser, muffling the already subdued sounds of the island. It pressed in, a suffocating blanket that swallowed the daylight, turning the mid-morning into a perpetual twilight. The compass needle vibrated violently, tugging him deeper into a grove of gnarled, wind-blasted trees whose branches clawed at the air like skeletal fingers. Before him, half swallowed by the encroaching earth, stood the entrance to an underground bunker. Its reinforced concrete door, rusted and scarred, hung ajar, a gaping maw in the side of a low, moss-covered hill. A chill, unlike any sea breeze, emanated from its depths, carrying with it a faint, cloying scent of brine and something else. Something indescribably old and vast. He pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting a stark swathe through the gloom. Inside, The air was stagnant, heavy, tasting of dust and decay. He navigated a winding corridor, the beam of his flashlight dancing over rusted conduits and crumbling sections of wall. He found the hidden chamber at the end of the corridor. The door, unlike the bunker's entrance, was made of thick, untreated wood, blackened with age, its iron hinges fused with rust. With a grunt, he forced it open, the sound a grating shriek that echoed unnaturally in the confined space. The air within the chamber was different, sharper, charged with an almost electrical hum. His flashlight beam played across a sight that stole the air from his lungs. In the center of the room, nestled within a crude stone altar, was an artifact that defied explanation. It was roughly spherical, obsidian black, but not smooth. Its surface was a chaotic tessellation of angles and planes that seemed to shift and writhe, refusing to hold a consistent shape in his perception. Veins of luminescent, sickly green light pulsed beneath its surface, a slow, rhythmic throb that mirrored the deep song now roaring in his ears. He felt an immense pressure, as if the very air was turning to water, pushing down on him. The object hummed, a low, guttural vibration that resonated deep within his bones. It was ancient, unimaginably old, and utterly alien. Not alien in the sense of from another planet, but alien in its very essence, its fundamental wrongness against the natural order. It was a tear, a wound, a focal point. As Dean instinctively reached out, drawn by an irresistible, terrifying curiosity, the air around the artifact shimmered. He didn't touch it, not quite, but his fingertips brushed the charged air surrounding it, and a horrifying vision slammed into his mind. He was no longer in the bunker. Above him, a distant, swirling vortex of absolute blackness, flecked with pinpricks of light that were not stars but something far more terrible. Vast eyes watching. Below, the island, his island, no longer solid rock but dissolving, crumbling into a fine dust that drifted down into the fathomless depths. And then he saw himself, not standing, but suspended, limbs flailing uselessly as he was drawn inexorably downwards, a tiny, insignificant mote against the backdrop of an indifferent, ancient hunger. The deep song was a deafening roar, a triumphant symphony of oblivion. The vision snapped shut, but the sensation of being crushed, of being dissolved, lingered. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the insistent thrum of the artifact. The entity, ancient and malevolent, was not merely stirring. It was awake, and it was coming for him. The deep song had not relinquished its hold. His teeth gritted, jaw aching, every nerve screaming against the encroaching stillness. A single bare bulb, suspended from a frayed wire, cast a weak, jaundiced glow that barely pushed back the shadows clinging to the corners. The song was no longer just an auditory assault. It had become a vibration, a deep thrumming that resonated in his bones, vibrating up through the soles of his boots. He could feel it in the tremors of the floor, the faint shuddering of the rough-hewn concrete. He staggered, pressing a hand against the clammy wall, the rough texture of the cement doing little to ground him. His own thoughts felt porous, his consciousness thinning at the edges, as if his mind were a sandcastle slowly eroding under an insistent tide. A sharp, almost imperceptible crack echoed through the bunker, not from the walls, but from deep within the earth beneath. Then another, closer, followed by a faint, wet-sucking sound, as if something vast and heavy were shifting. He imagined the unseen depths, the colossal mass turning, its gaze, if it had one fixed on this fragile pocket of air. It wasn't just trying to lure him. It was actively trying to breach, to break through the last vestiges of protection, whether physical or spiritual, that the bunker offered. He pushed away from the wall, his gaze sweeping the cramped space, searching. His hands, trembling, scrabbled for the leather-bound journal he'd left on the small, rickety wooden table. This was it. This was the last stand. It had to be. He fumbled open the journal, the brittle pages rustling like dry leaves. The faint scent of aged paper and something else. Salt, mildew, and a faint, unsettling hint of decay rose from the open book. The grandfather's hand, usually so precise in its entries about tides and weather, became frantic in these later pages, the ink smudged, words underlined multiple times. More urgent. The page was heavily annotated, scrawled with marginalia in a desperate hand. The heading, in stark, heavy strokes, read, "The breach, the ceiling." Dean's breath hitched. He leaned closer, the faint light glinting off the yellowed paper. The grandfather had described a ritual not to destroy the entity. He'd underlined the impossibility of that, but to seal it, to force it back into its slumber, to sever its connection to the surface world. The text was fragmented, almost poetic in its grim descriptions. It spoke of the conduit, the sacrifice of truth, and the turning of the key. The words swam before Dean's eyes, his mind struggling to piece together the meaning through the haze of the deep song. The conduit, he realized, was himself. His own connection to the island, his grandfather's bloodline. And the turning of the key, that was the act, the mechanism. But the sacrifice. It wasn't blood. It wasn't a life. The journal spoke of the cartographer's deepest memory. The very maps of self, and the truth of what binds you. It wasn't just a memory, but the meaning behind it. The core of his identity, the very thing that made him Dean. His grandfather had written, "To sever its hold, one must sever their own. To erase its path, one must erase their own. The greatest truth, the greatest sorrow, must be unmade, unwritten, as if it never was." Dean's mind reeled. His deepest memory, his greatest sorrow. It was his family, his wife, his child. The journal wasn't asking for his life. It was asking for his grief, for the memory of their faces, their laughter, their love, for the entire agonizing, beautiful, devastating map of his past. To forget them, to truly, utterly forget them, as if they had never existed. A low growl, not human, not animal, resonated from the very foundations of the bunker, shaking the table, rattling the loose pages of the journal. The entity was pressing harder, its patience wearing thin. Dean's vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, overwhelming horror of the choice. To forget them, to erase the very reason he continued to breathe, to deny the profound love and loss that had shaped him. It was a sacrifice that felt worse than death. It was the obliteration of his very soul, his hand clenched, crumpling the brittle page. The choice was stark, brutal, and immediate. Surrender to the song, let the entity consume him and whatever remained of his memories, or sever the deepest ties that bound him to humanity, to the very essence of who he was. The entity would not have them. It would not have him. Not entirely. He would pay the price. He would unmake himself if that was what it took to unmake it. The world outside Dean's cottage had become a living, screaming entity. It was the sustained note of the entity's awakening, a psychic pressure so profound it twisted the very fabric of the island. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to quell the throbbing behind his eyes, a relentless beat that echoed the ocean's increasingly frantic pulse. Wind, an impossible gale, shrieked around the small structure, not merely strong, but malevolent, carrying with it the stench of wet earth and something else. A cloying, sweet decay that made his stomach churn. Through the grimy panes of the window, he watched the island writhe. The gnarled trees, already bent by generations of storms, now thrashed like desperate supplicants, their branches tearing at the sky. The normally resilient kelp beds offshore, usually a deep, verdant green, had taken on an oily, purple sheen, writhing with an unnatural animation, reaching towards the shore like skeletal fingers. Even the rocks, the steadfast sentinels of the coastline, seemed to weep, dark, viscous streaks bleeding down their gray faces, dissolving into the foam. He knew what this was. The journal had hinted at it, described the signs of the entity's full emergence, the way it bent reality to its will, shaping the physical world to reflect its abyssal nature. It wasn't just a storm. It was the island's agony, a physical manifestation of the psychic assault. Dean's own mind felt like a sieve, his thoughts fragmenting, slipping away like sand. That was the entity's true weapon, he realized, its insidious lure. His grief, yes, but also the very core of what made him Dean, the man who had loved and lost and now remembered. To give up the grief was to give up the memory, to sever the last agonizing link to his wife and child. He clutched the journal, its aged leather cover slick with the condensation that now seeped through the cottage walls. Its final pages, brittle and yellowed, detailed the counter-ritual. It wasn't an exorcism, not in the traditional sense. It was a severing, a re-imposition of the ancient pact, but one that demanded a profound and specific offering. A memory, distilled to its rawest essence, surrendered not to the entity, but to the sea itself, sealed with a final deliberate act of letting go. The journal spoke of a specific location, a place of convergence, where the island's ley lines intersected with the deepest currents of the ocean's power. The underground bunker. Now the words in the journal glowed with a terrible clarity. It was a crucible, a point of no return. But beneath the fear, a desperate resolve had taken root. He had come here to escape his past, to outrun the pain. Now the only way forward was to confront it, to offer it up as the ultimate sacrifice. He would not let this thing, this ancient horror, consume what little remained of his world, or desecrate the memory of those he loved. He gathered what he needed. A small, smooth stone he'd found on the beach, a fragment of shell, a single dried flower he'd kept pressed between the journal's pages. Small tokens, each imbued with a sliver of his past, his joy, his sorrow. Stepping out of the cottage was like walking into a different dimension. The wind tore at his clothes, a physical force threatening to rip him from his feet. The air was thick with a fine, stinging mist that tasted of brine and something acrid, metallic. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, yielding, as if the very earth was losing its cohesion. The path to the lighthouse, usually a familiar trek, was now a treacherous maze. "You could forget," one voice hissed, like sand sifting through bone. "What use are these ghosts?" He shook his head, clamping his jaw shut, forcing himself to focus on the faint outline of the lighthouse ahead. Each step was a battle, not just against the elements, but against the insidious invasion of his own mind. The underground bunker awaited. And inside, Dean knew he would face the ultimate choice. Surrender his grief, and with it, perhaps, his very essence, or be consumed entirely. Armed with nothing but a desperate hope and the faded, water-stained pages of his grandfather's journal clutched tight in his freezing hand. The lighthouse, when he finally reached its base, was a skeletal finger against the churning sky, its beam a fractured, frantic sweep through the thick, wet air. Rain lashed at the old stone, each drop feeling like a tiny pebble thrown by an unseen hand. He fumbled for the heavy iron door, the metal cold and slick beneath his fingers, a groan of rusted hinges answering his shove. He didn't climb the spiral stairs. The journal had been clear. The true heart of the island's affliction lay deeper. Guided by a crudely drawn map within the journal, Dean found a section of the floor near the base of the lighthouse, hidden beneath a loose flagstone. He strained, grunting with effort, to lever it aside, revealing a gaping black maw. A ladder, ancient and corroded, descended into the earth. The air that wafted up was colder, thicker, carrying a scent that was undeniably oceanic, yet utterly wrong, like the bottom of the deepest trench, long undisturbed. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the determination in his chest warring with a rising nausea, and began his descent. Each rung was slick with moisture, his boots finding precarious purchase. He pulled out the heavy-duty lantern he'd brought, its beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. The ladder ended on a damp, uneven floor, leading into a narrow, winding passage carved from raw rock. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing like slow, deliberate footsteps. This was the underground bunker his grandfather had warned of, the true anchor point of the ancient pact. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous space. It wasn't natural. The walls were smoothed, almost polished, by some unknown force converging towards a central platform. The lantern's beam struggled against an encroaching gloom that seemed to absorb light, a palpable presence. He saw it then. Or rather, he felt it. It was a tear in the fabric of reality, a gaping wound where the familiar world bled into something else entirely. "No," he rasped, his voice a fragile thing against the immense pressure. He forced his eyes open, forcing himself to look at the shimmering tear. This was it, the portal, the source of the island's encroaching madness. He consulted the journal, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages to the final cryptic entry. His grandfather's frantic scrawl detailed the ritual, a sacrifice of self, a severing of the link, using a specific series of symbols etched into the platform, and an offering of pure intent. He fought the urge to succumb, fought the insidious pull. He knew it was a trick, a manipulation of his grief, a final, desperate attempt by the entity to break him. His fingers, stiff and numb, traced the ancient, faint etchings on the platform. Symbols his grandfather had described, meant to bind and sever. As his fingers followed the lines, a faint phosphorescent glow emanated from the carvings. The hum in the bunker deepened, becoming a roar, like 1,000 unseen waves crashing simultaneously. The personal sacrifice wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a fundamental severing. It was a final, terrible act of surrender, not to the entity, but to the ritual. To seal the portal, he had to offer his connection to the very thing that made him human, the capacity to remember and mourn. He envisioned his grief, his sorrow, his undying love as a tether, a shining, fragile thread connecting him to the past, to his loved one, and now, he realized, to the entity. With every ounce of his will, every fiber of his being, Dean began to sever that thread. A blinding flash of indigo light erupted from the portal, followed by a sound that was not a scream, but the tearing of reality itself. Dean felt a profound, agonizing wrench within him, a part of his very essence being ripped away. The voices, the visions, the crushing despair, they all intensified to an unbearable crescendo, then abruptly snapped. The hum died. Dean opened his eyes. He was alone in the vast, echoing underground bunker, the only sound the slow, rhythmic drip of water. He felt empty. Not peaceful, not relieved, but utterly, profoundly empty. The memory of his loved one was still there, a ghost of an image, but the emotional resonance, the sharp, defining ache, had been excised. He had sealed the portal, but he had also sealed away a piece of himself, a piece he knew he could never reclaim. Dean stumbled forward onto the platform, its cold, slick surface unforgiving beneath his boots. This was it, the heart of the underground bunker, a place of iron and dripping stone, constructed not to keep things out, but to keep something in. The air itself vibrated with an unseen pressure, a low thrum that burrowed into his bones. He felt himself falling, not through space, but through the fabric of his own mind, unraveling thread by thread. Each voice, a tendril of icy despair wrapped around a memory, twisting it, corrupting it. It's so much easier here. He saw not just her, but fleeting images of his grandfather, of the lighthouse keeper before him, their faces etched with the same weary resignation, the same haunting peace. They had all given in, hadn't they? Surrendered to the siren call, allowed their consciousness to be absorbed into the deep song. Was that the pact? Not to fight it, but to join it, to become one more note in its eternal, sorrowful chorus. A jolt, sharp and sudden, pierced through the haze of despair. His grandfather's journals, the cryptic maps. They weren't just charting the island's physical features, but its spiritual ones, its points of ingress and egress, the pathways of the deep song. The old man hadn't just kept the lighthouse. He had mapped the very boundaries of the encroaching horror, seeking to understand its language, its patterns. Dean's eyes, burning with a desperate resolve, scanned the ancient iron grate beneath his feet, the intricate, almost circuit-like patterns etched into the metal. It wasn't just decorative. It was a conduit, a focal point. He remembered a particular diagram, a series of concentric circles, lines radiating outward, labeled with indecipherable symbols. He had dismissed them as mad scribblings then. Now they screamed their truth. The bunker was a tuning fork, designed to resonate with the deep song, to draw it, but also, crucially, to contain it. The platform was not meant for sacrifice, but for an act of will. The entity fed on grief, yes, but it recoiled from understanding, from the imposition of order. It was chaos given form, a formless hunger. Dean saw the small, almost imperceptible lever embedded in the side of a massive rusted pillar directly across from him. It was the same lever depicted in one of the journal's final frantic sketches. The release, his grandfather had scrawled, then the rejection. With a strength he didn't know he possessed, Dean pushed against the relentless pull. He clawed his way forward, each step a monumental effort against the pressure that sought to flatten him. The faces multiplied, contorted, screamed soundlessly. The lever was stiff, almost fused with rust. He gritted his teeth, his muscles screaming, and heaved. There was a grinding screech, a sound of metal tearing as the lever slowly, agonizingly began to move. A tremor ran through the entire underground bunker, shaking dust from the ceiling, dislodging pebbles that clattered into the unseen depths. The indigo light intensified. Then, with a deafening thrum that felt like his skull was splitting, it abruptly contracted. The chorus of voices became a singular, piercing shriek of pure agony. The face of his lost loved one dissolved, twisting into a grotesque mask of rage and pain before flickering out of existence entirely. The deep song had been pushed back, its tendrils severed, but the recoil was devastating. A torrent of unfiltered knowledge flooded Dean's mind, not in words, but in raw, visceral understanding. The island was a scar, a wound in the earth, and the deep song was the ancient weeping blood that seeped from it. His grandfather hadn't just kept watch. He had been a dam, constantly shoring up the crumbling edges of reality with his own sanity, his own despair, his own life. The pact wasn't a surrender. It was a constant, excruciating battle of wills, a psychic tether to keep the vast, unknowable hunger from consuming everything. Dean had just severed that tether. He had broken the dam. He collapsed onto the platform, gasping, the air suddenly thick and heavy. The silence was absolute, a profound, crushing void where the whispers had been. He had pushed it back, yes, but he had also seen it, truly seen it, and it had seen him in return. The knowledge was a burning acid in his mind, searing away the comforting illusions, the gentle lies of the world. He understood the deep song now, its boundless sorrow, its ancient purpose, its unending hunger. And that understanding, that terrible, beautiful truth, was the cost. Dean pushed himself up, his body trembling, his mind a raw, exposed nerve. The island air, though still thick with fog, felt strangely thin, unreal. He looked at the waves, churning against the shore, and he no longer saw water. He saw a living, breathing skin stretched taut over something vast and terrible. It had already claimed him,